The scream had already faded when the first light broke over the Montana plains, but the terror still clung to the air like smoke from a dying campfire. Sarah Mitchell lay crumpled beside the overturned stagecoach, her dress torn and bloodied, her breathing shallow and desperate. The outlaws had taken everything. The strongbox, the horses, her father's gold watch that she'd clutched like a lifeline during the attack. But they'd left her alive, and in the merciless world of the frontier, that was either a blessing or a curse she hadn't yet determined. The wind whistled through the scattered debris of her former life, stirring dust devils that danced around broken luggage and splintered wood. Her lips were cracked from thirst, her skin burned raw by the unforgiving sun that had beaten down on her for what felt like an eternity. Every breath sent sharp pains through her ribs where the outlaw leader's boot had connected, and she could taste blood in her mouth from where he'd struck her when she'd tried to fight back. Sarah had been traveling to meet her intended husband in Silver Creek, a man she'd never met but who'd promised her a new life through carefully worded letters. Now those letters lay scattered in the wind, torn to pieces like her dreams of starting over. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd fled one nightmare only to find herself living in another. The sound of hoofbeats cutting through the morning silence made her blood run cold. They were coming back. Maybe they'd decided that leaving a witness alive had been a mistake. Maybe they wanted to finish what they'd started. Sarah tried to push herself up, to run, to hide, but her body betrayed her. Her legs wouldn't support her weight, and she collapsed back to the hard ground with a sob that echoed across the empty landscape. But the rider who appeared over the ridge wasn't one of the men who'd destroyed her life. This man sat his horse differently, with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle, not the predatory swagger of an outlaw. His hat was pulled low over his eyes, and a long duster coat flapped behind him in the wind like dark wings. A true cowboy, weathered by years of driving cattle across endless miles of unforgiving territory. He reined in his horse 20 feet away and sat motionless for a long moment, taking in the scene with eyes that had seen too much violence to be shocked by it. Sarah could see his face now, angular and sun-darkened, with lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into harsh sunlight and harder truths. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a white line that told its own story of survival against the odds. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and gravelly, like rocks grinding together in a creek bed. "You hurt bad, miss." Sarah tried to answer, but all that came out was a broken whisper. I can't hold it in anymore." The words tumbled out in a rush of pain and desperation. "Please, I need help. I'll do anything, give you anything you want. Just don't leave me here to die." The cowboy dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He approached her like he would a wounded animal, carefully, respectfully, giving her space to bolt if her instincts told her to run. When he was close enough, she could see his eyes clearly for the first time. They were gray as storm clouds, and in them she saw something that made her breath catch. Recognition. Not of her face, but of her situation. This man had been where she was now. Broken, desperate, begging strangers for mercy. He hesitated for just a moment, his hand hovering over the gun at his hip. Sarah's heart stopped, certain that her plea for help had fallen on deaf ears, that he was about to do something that would end her suffering in the most final way possible. Instead, he did something that would haunt her dreams for very different reasons. He holstered his weapon, shrugged out of his duster, and gently wrapped it around her trembling shoulders. The leather duster still held the warmth of his body, and the scent of trail dust, horses, and something indefinably masculine that made Sarah feel safer than she had in days. The cowboy crouched beside her, his movements economical and practiced, like a man who'd tended wounded animals on long cattle drives where veterinarians were a luxury no one could afford. "Name's Cole Brennan," he said, his voice gentler now but still carrying that gravelly edge. "I'm going to take a look at your injuries, but I need you to tell me if anything I do causes you pain. Can you do that for me, miss?" Sarah nodded weakly, studying his face as he began his examination. There was something about Cole Brennan that set him apart from other men she'd known. He moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent years making life or death decisions in the middle of nowhere. But his touch was surprisingly gentle, as he checked her pulse and looked for signs of serious injury. "Sarah," she whispered, finding her voice at last. "Sarah Mitchell." "Well, Miss Sarah Mitchell," Cole said, carefully probing her ribs through the fabric of her torn dress, "you're banged up pretty good, but I don't think anything's broken. That's a miracle considering what happened here." His eyes swept over the wreckage of the stagecoach, taking in details she hadn't even noticed in her panic. "You know who did this?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. Cole's expression darkened. "Boot prints match the gang that's been hitting coaches along this route for the past month. Led by a man named Black Pete Corrigan, they usually don't leave witnesses." His gray eyes met hers and she saw something that made her stomach clench with fresh fear. "Fact that you're still breathing means one of two things. Either they're getting careless, or they left you alive for a reason." The implication hung in the air between them like a loaded gun. Sarah pulled his duster tighter around herself, trying to ward off a chill that had nothing to do with the morning wind. "What kind of reason?" she forced herself to ask. Cole was quiet for a long moment, scanning the horizon as if expecting trouble to come riding over the nearest hill. Could be they're planning to come back. Could be they want someone to spread word about what they're capable of. Or could be... He paused, his jaw working as if he were chewing on words too bitter to swallow. Could be what? Could be they recognized you from somewhere. You got family in these parts? Anyone who might have put a price on your head? Sarah shook her head frantically. "No, nobody. I was traveling to Silver Creek to meet my intended husband. I've never been in Montana before in my life." Cole studied her face with the intensity of a man reading tracks in difficult terrain. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, because some of the tension left his shoulders. "All right then. We need to get you somewhere safe before they decide to come back and tie up loose ends." He stood up, brushing dust off his knees. "There's a way station about 5 miles north of here. Owner's an old friend of mine. Good man who knows how to keep his mouth shut when it matters." "I don't have any money," Sarah said quickly. "They took everything. My purse, my jewelry, even my father's watch." Her voice broke on the last words. That watch had been the only thing of value she'd owned, a connection to better times when her family had been whole, and the future had seemed bright with possibility. Cole's expression softened. "Money ain't always the most important currency out here, Miss Mitchell. Sometimes a person's word is worth more than gold." He extended his hand to help her up. "Can you stand?" Sarah took his calloused hand and felt strength flow into her from that simple contact. Her legs were shaky, but they held her weight. Cole kept his arm around her waist, supporting her without making her feel helpless. "That's it," he encouraged. "Easy does it." As they made their way toward his horse, a sturdy paint gelding that watched their approach with intelligent eyes, Sarah found herself studying her rescuer more closely. Cole Brennan moved like a man who'd spent more time in the saddle than on the ground, his long legs carrying him with an easy, rolling gait. His clothes were well worn but clean, and his gun rode low on his hip with the familiarity of a tool that had seen regular use. "Mr. Brennan," she said as he helped her mount behind him, "why are you helping me?" "Most men would have." She trailed off, unable to voice the dark possibilities that had been running through her mind. Cole settled into the saddle in front of her and gathered the reins. "Most men ain't been where I've been, Miss Mitchell." His voice carried a weight that spoke of hard experience. "Few years back, I was the one lying broken beside a trail, begging strangers for help. Some passed me by. Some stopped long enough to rob what little I had left. But one man, a preacher heading to a revival meeting, he loaded me into his wagon and took me to town. Paid for the doctor out of his own pocket. Never asked for anything in return." "What happened to you?" "Cattle stampede. Horse went down under me, broke my leg in 3 places. Would have died if not for that preacher's kindness." Cole urged his horse into a gentle walk, mindful of Sarah's injuries. "I made a promise that day that I'd never ride past someone in need if I had the power to help them." Sarah felt tears sting her eyes, the first tears that weren't born of pain or fear since the attack. "He sounds like a good man." He was. Died of cholera the next winter, but not before he taught me something important about what it means to be human in a place that tries its best to strip that humanity away from you. They rode in comfortable silence for a while. the paint's steady gait eating up the miles between them and safety. Sarah found herself relaxing against Cole's broad back, feeling more secure than she had in weeks. There was something solid and dependable about him, like a mountain that had weathered countless storms and remained standing. "Mr. Brennan," she said finally, "what you did back there, wrapping your coat around me instead of taking advantage of my situation, that was the horrifying thing the title mentioned, wasn't it? You showed kindness when I expected cruelty." Cole chuckled, a low rumble she could feel through his chest. "Horrifying to some folks, I suppose. World's gotten so hard that basic human decency seems shocking when you encounter it. Where are you headed? I mean, after you get me to safety." "I'm working a cattle drive that's supposed to meet up with the main herd just outside Silver Creek. Been tracking some strays that wandered off during a river crossing about a week back." He glanced over his shoulder at her. "Funny coincidence that you were headed to the same place. Not so funny if those outlaws are still in the area." Cole's hand dropped to rest on the butt of his gun. "Let me worry about Black Pete and his boys. Right now, your job is to heal up and figure out what you want to do next. This intended husband of yours, you know anything about him besides what he'd put in his letters?" Sarah's stomach clenched as she realized she'd been so focused on escaping her past that she'd never really considered what kind of future she might be walking into. "Not much," she admitted. "His name is Harold Whitmore. He owns a dry goods store in Silver Creek. Says he's looking for a wife to help him run the business and keep house. That's all?" He seemed kind in his letters. Respectful. He didn't ask for personal details like some of the other men who answered my advertisement. Cole was quiet for a moment. "Miss Mitchell, I hope you won't take offense at what I'm about to say, but a woman in your situation might want to consider whether she's making decisions based on desperation rather than good judgment." The words stung because they hit too close to home. "I didn't have many options, Mr. Brennan. Sometimes desperation is all the luxury a person can afford. I understand that, but maybe now you've got time to think about what you really want instead of just what you think you can get." Before Sarah could respond, Cole suddenly tensed in the saddle. His hand moved to his gun as he scanned the terrain ahead of them. "What is it?" she whispered. "Riders coming fast from the north? Could be trouble." Sarah's blood turned to ice in her veins. "The outlaws? Maybe. Maybe not. But we're about to find out." Cole spurred his horse toward a cluster of rocks that offered some cover. "Whatever happens, Miss Mitchell, you stay behind those boulders and don't come out until I tell you it's safe." As the sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, Sarah realized that her nightmare might be far from over. And Cole Brennan, the man who'd shown her the first kindness she'd experienced in months, might be about to pay the ultimate price for his compassion. The question that would haunt her for the rest of her life was already forming in her mind. How many good men would have to die because she'd been foolish enough to believe in the possibility of a better future? The riders crested the hill like a dark storm cloud, their horses kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the still morning air. Cole counted 5 men, all armed, all riding with the purposeful intensity of hunters who'd caught the scent of their prey. His jaw tightened as he recognized the lead rider's distinctive black hat and the cruel set of his shoulders. "Black Pete Corrigan," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to Sarah. Sarah's sharp intake of breath told him she'd heard. "They came back for me," she whispered, her voice hollow with despair. "You should leave me here, Mr. Brennan. Ride away before they see you. I won't be responsible for getting another good man killed." Cole's hand never wavered from his gun as he guided his horse behind the largest boulder. "Miss Mitchell, I've been running cattle across this territory for 8 years. In all that time, I've never once left an injured animal to the wolves. I sure as hell ain't starting with a human being." The outlaws were close enough now that Cole could make out individual faces. Black Pete rode in the center, his coal-black beard streaked with silver, and his eyes scanning the landscape with the predatory focus of a hawk searching for field mice. To his left rode a thin, weasel-faced man Cole recognized as Tommy the Snake Morrison, known for his skill with a knife and his complete lack of conscience. The other 3 were typical hard cases, men who'd chosen the outlaw trail because it was easier than honest work and more profitable than death. "Stay down," Cole whispered to Sarah as he dismounted and checked his weapons. His Colt 45 was fully loaded, and he had a Winchester rifle in his saddle scabbard. Against 5 experienced killers, it might not be enough, but it would have to do. The outlaws had stopped about 50 yards away, close enough for conversation but far enough to make accurate shooting difficult. Black Pete stood in his stirrups, his voice carrying clearly across the morning air. "Cole Brennan," he called out, his tone almost jovial. "Fancy meeting you out here in the middle of nowhere. Word on the trail is you've been asking questions about our recent business ventures." Cole stepped out from behind the boulder, keeping his hand near his gun, but not quite drawing it. "Pete, been a while." "Indeed it has, old friend. Last time I saw you was in Deadwood, wasn't it? Right before you decided to go all righteous on us and quit the gang." Sarah's gasp behind him was barely audible, but Cole felt it like a physical blow. He'd known this moment would come eventually. The moment when his past would collide with his present, and someone would have to pay the price for the man he used to be. "That was a long time ago, Pete. Different life, different choices." Black Pete laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Oh, but Cole, we both know there ain't no such thing as a clean slate out here. Once you've ridden with us, you're family forever. Ain't that right, boys?" The other outlaws chuckled and nodded, their hands moving to rest on their weapons. Cole could see the trap closing around him like a noose. If he fought, Sarah would likely die in the crossfire. If he surrendered, they'd both die anyway, just more slowly. "What do you want, Pete?" "Well, now that's simple enough. We had ourselves a little disagreement with a lady passenger yesterday, and she seems to have wandered off before we could finish our conversation. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Cole's mind raced, looking for an angle, any advantage that might get them out of this alive. "Can't say that I do. Been tracking strays for the past week. Haven't seen hide nor hair of any passengers." "Now, Cole, that hurts my feelings. Here I was thinking we could have an honest conversation between old friends." Black Pete's hand moved to his gun. "See, the thing is, we found horse tracks leading away from the coach. Fresh tracks made this morning, and they lead right to this little cluster of rocks where you're standing." Behind the boulder, Sarah was trembling so hard Cole could hear her teeth chattering. He knew she was fighting every instinct to run, to scream, to do something, anything, that might relieve the unbearable tension. But she stayed hidden and stayed quiet, trusting him to find a way out of this nightmare. "You always were good at reading sign, Pete. I'll give you that." Cole took a careful step to his left, angling himself so that Sarah would be shielded by his body if the shooting started. "But you might want to consider that tracking a man like me might not be the smartest thing you've ever done." "Is that a threat, Cole?" "It's a reminder. You remember what happened to the Jameson brothers when they tried to bushwhack me outside Billings?" For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Black Pete's eyes. The Jameson brothers had been found 3 days later, their bodies arranged in a neat row beside their campfire. No one had ever proven Cole was responsible, but the message had been clear enough that most sensible outlaws had given him a wide berth ever since. "That was different," Pete said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. "You were alone then. Now you've got a lady to protect. Makes a man vulnerable, caring about someone else. Or it makes him desperate, and you know better than most what a desperate man is capable of." The standoff stretched on, 5 armed men facing one, while somewhere behind the rocks, a terrified woman waited to see which direction her fate would turn. The morning sun climbed higher, and the silence grew thick as smoke from a greenwood fire. It was Tommy Morrison who broke first. His hand dropped to his knife, and he started to dismount, probably figuring he could circle around and get behind Cole while Pete kept him talking. It was a good plan, but Cole had been expecting it. The Winchester came out of its scabbard like a striking snake, and Cole's first shot took Tommy in the chest before his feet touched the ground. The outlaw pitched backward over his horse's rump, his knife spinning away into the dust. The other 4 men went for their guns, but Cole was already moving, using his horse as cover while he worked the Winchester's lever action. His second shot caught one of the unnamed hard cases in the shoulder, spinning him around in his saddle. The man's return shot went wide, the bullet whining off stone inches from Cole's head. Black Pete's gun was out now, and he was firing as fast as he could thumb back the hammer. Cole felt the wind of a bullet pass his ear as he dove behind a fallen log, Sarah's scream echoing in the morning air. "Stay down!" he shouted to her, not daring to look back and see if she was following his orders. The gunfight was brutal and brief, the way most real shootouts were. There was none of the elaborate choreography of dime novel gunfights, just desperate men trying to kill each other as quickly and efficiently as possible. Cole's years of experience told in the steady accuracy of his shooting, while the outlaw's shots went wild under pressure. When the smoke cleared, 3 men lay dead in the dust. Black Pete clutched a wounded arm, his gun fallen from nerveless fingers. The 5th outlaw had turned tail and run when he realized the fight wasn't going their way. Cole stood slowly, his rifle trained on Pete, his breathing heavy but controlled. "It's over, Pete. Ride away and don't come back." Black Pete looked at his dead companions, then at the blood seeping through his shirt sleeve. When he spoke, his voice was thick with pain and something that might have been regret. "This ain't over between us, Cole. You can't change what you were just by pretending to be something else. The blood on your hands is still there, no matter how many innocent folks you try to save." "Maybe so," Cole replied quietly, "but I can choose what I do from here on out." "That's something you never understood." Pete managed to climb back into his saddle, favoring his wounded arm. "That girl you're protecting, you tell her she's living on borrowed time. Word gets out that Black Pete Corrigan was bested by a washed-up cowboy. I'll have every gun in the territory looking to make a reputation. She'll never be safe." With that parting threat, he spurred his horse and rode away, leaving behind 3 corpses and the smell of gun smoke hanging in the still air. Cole waited until Pete was out of sight before turning to check on Sarah. She was crouched behind the boulder where he'd left her, her face pale as winter snow, but her eyes were clear and focused. "Is it over?" she asked. "For now?" Cole began reloading his rifle, his movements automatic after years of practice. But Pete was right about one thing. Word of this fight will spread. There'll be others looking for us. Sarah stood on unsteady legs, Cole's duster still wrapped around her shoulders like armor. "Mr. Brennan, what Black Pete said about you riding with them, is it true?" Cole's hands stilled on his rifle. He'd known this question would come, but knowing hadn't made it any easier to answer. "Yes," he said simply. "It's true. I rode with Pete's gang for 2 years, from when I was 19 until I was 21. Did things I'm not proud of, hurt people who didn't deserve it. What changed? We robbed a stage outside Denver. Family traveling to start a new life. Husband, wife, little girl about 8 years old. Pete wanted to kill them all, leave no witnesses. Quote. Cole's voice caught. I couldn't do it. Couldn't kill a child, so I helped them escape instead. And that was the end of my outlaw days. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with those penetrating green eyes. Do you regret it? Leaving that life behind? Every day, Cole said without hesitation. Not because I miss the violence or the money, but because I can never undo the harm I caused. Best I can do now is try to balance the scales, save a few more lives than I took. And is that what I am to you? A way to balance the scales? Cole met her gaze directly, letting her see the truth in his eyes. At first, maybe, but now. He paused, surprised by the honesty of his own feelings. Now I think you might be something more important than that. What? A chance to remember what it feels like to be the man I was meant to be, instead of the one I became. As they prepared to continue their journey to the way station, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the distant ridge. Pete's fifth man, the one who'd run from the fight. He'd seen everything, and he was already planning how much the information might be worth to the right people. Sarah Mitchell wasn't just a witness to a stagecoach robbery anymore. She was a woman traveling with a man whose past made him valuable to certain parties, and in a territory where information was often more precious than gold, that made her a target worth pursuing. The way station emerged from the heat, shimmer like a mirage made real. A squat adobe building with a red tile roof and a wooden corral, where a handful of horses stood with their heads hanging low in the midday sun. Smoke rose from the chimney, and the sound of hammering rang across the dusty yard, where a heavy-set man with graying hair was working on what looked like a new gatepost. "That's Miguel Santos," Cole said as they approached. "Ran supplies for the army before he retired out here. Good man to have on your side in a fight, and better still to have as a friend when you need a place to lay low." Sarah shifted behind him in the saddle, her arms tightening around his waist as the reality of what had happened began to sink in. She'd watched a man kill 3 other men to protect her, and now she was riding toward an uncertain future with someone whose past was darker than anything she'd imagined when she left her old life behind. Miguel looked up from his work as they rode into the yard, his weathered face breaking into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Cole had seen that look before, the expression of a man who'd learned to be cautious about unexpected visitors in a land where trouble had a way of following decent folks around. "Cole Brennan," Miguel called out, setting down his hammer and wiping his hands on a leather apron. "What brings you to my humble establishment, and in the company of such a lovely lady, no less?" Cole dismounted and helped Sarah down, noting how she winced when her feet touched the ground. The ride had been hard on her injured body, but she'd endured it without complaint. There was more steel in this woman than her delicate appearance suggested. "Miguel, I'd like you to meet Miss Sarah Mitchell. She's had some trouble on the trail, and I was hoping you might have a room where she could rest up for a few days." Miguel's eyes took in Sarah's torn dress, the bruises on her face, and the way she held herself like someone who'd recently taken a beating. His expression darkened as understanding dawned. "Outlaws?" he asked quietly. "Black Pete's gang," Cole confirmed. "Hit her stage yesterday, left her for dead. We ran into Pete and his boys about an hour ago. And 3 of them won't be bothering anyone anymore." Pete rode off with a bullet in his arm and his tail between his legs. Miguel whistled low under his breath. "That'll stir up a hornet's nest. Pete's got friends in low places, and they don't take kindly to folks who interfere with their business." "I know. That's why Miss Mitchell needs somewhere safe to stay while things cool down." Miguel studied Sarah with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to judge character quickly and accurately. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him, because his stern expression softened into something approaching kindness. "Of course, señorita. My casa is your casa for as long as you need it." He turned to Cole. "But what about you, amigo? You can't ride back out there alone. Not with Pete's whole gang looking for revenge. I've got cattle to find and a trail boss who's expecting me back. Can't let the whole drive suffer because of my troubles." "Your troubles?" Sarah spoke up for the first time since they'd arrived, her voice stronger than Cole had heard it since the attack. "Mr. Brennan, those men weren't after you because of anything you'd done recently. They were after me, and you got caught in the middle trying to help." Cole turned to face her, seeing something in her green eyes that hadn't been there before. A spark of defiance that reminded him why he'd felt compelled to help her in the first place. "Miss Mitchell, I made my own choices back there. You didn't force me to do anything." "No, but I also didn't give you all the information you needed to make an informed choice." Sarah took a deep breath, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "There's something I haven't told you about why I was traveling to Silver Creek." Miguel glanced between them, then cleared his throat diplomatically. Perhaps this conversation would be better held inside, where the walls have ears only for those who need to hear. The interior of the way station was cool and dim after the harsh sunlight outside. Miguel led them to a small sitting room furnished with handmade chairs and a table that had seen better days but was still solid and serviceable. A pot of coffee simmered on the wood stove, filling the air with a rich aroma that reminded Sarah she hadn't eaten since the morning before. "Sit, please," Miguel said, pouring coffee into 3 chipped but clean cups. "And señorita, tell us what weighs so heavily on your heart." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm cup as she gathered her courage. "Mr. Brennan, when I told you I was traveling to meet my intended husband, I wasn't entirely truthful." Cole leaned back in his chair, his gray eyes never leaving her face. "In what way? Harold Whitmore isn't just some dry goods merchant looking for a wife. He's my half-brother." The silence that followed was so complete that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Cole's expression didn't change, but she saw his hand move unconsciously toward his gun, a gesture so automatic he probably wasn't even aware of it. Your half-brother, he repeated carefully. My father had an affair when I was 12. Harold was the result. My mother never knew. At least, I don't think she did. But my father told me about him on his deathbed 3 years ago. Said he'd been sending money to help support Harold and his mother all those years. And now Harold's mother's dead, and my father's estate is tied up in legal battles with creditors. Harold wrote to me last month, said he had a business proposition that could benefit us both. He wanted me to come to Silver Creek and pose as his mail-order bride so we could legally combine our resources and salvage what's left of our father's investments. Miguel made a soft sound of understanding. A marriage of convenience, but between siblings. Not exactly legal, even if you are only half-siblings. We weren't planning to actually go through with a real marriage, Sarah said quickly. Just a ceremony for appearances, maybe live in the same house for a few months until we could quietly annul it and claim irreconcilable differences. By then, we'd have had time to liquidate our father's remaining assets and split them properly. Cole was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if the dark liquid might hold answers to questions he wasn't ready to ask. So when you said you'd never been to Montana before, that was true. But when you said you didn't know anyone who might have a reason to want you dead, I thought I was telling the truth then too. But now I'm wondering if maybe Harold has more enemies than he let on in his letters. Or maybe someone found out about our plan and decided to stop it before we could pull it off. What kind of investments are we talking about? Miguel asked. How much money? Sarah's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. I'm not entirely sure. Harold was always vague about the details in his letters, but he made it sound like there was enough to set us both up for life if we could get our hands on it legally. Cole stood up abruptly and walked to the window, his back rigid with tension. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, but Sarah could hear the anger simmering beneath the surface. Miss Mitchell, do you have any idea how many people have died over the kind of scheme you're describing? How many families have been destroyed by relatives fighting over money? It's not like that, Sarah protested. Harold and I barely know each other. This is strictly business. Business that requires you to lie to a preacher, lie to a whole town, and commit fraud in the eyes of both God and the law. Cole turned back to face her, his gray eyes harder than she'd ever seen them. And you're asking me to help you do it. I'm not asking you to do anything except what you've already done. Help me get to Silver Creek safely. What I do after that is my own concern. Is it? Because right now you've got Black Pete's gang hunting you, possibly other enemies you don't even know about, and you're planning to walk into a situation that could get you killed or thrown in prison. How exactly is that your own concern when I'm the one who'll have to live with the consequences if something happens to you? The raw emotion in his voice caught Sarah off guard. She'd expected judgment, maybe even rejection, but not this fierce protectiveness that seemed to have caught Cole himself by surprise. Miguel cleared his throat again. Perhaps we should all take a moment to think about this calmly. Señorita Sarah, you have been through a terrible ordeal, and your judgment may not be at its best right now. And Cole, mi amigo, you cannot save someone who does not wish to be saved. She doesn't need saving from outlaws or gunfights, Cole said bitterly. She needs saving from herself. That's not fair, Sarah flared, her own temper finally breaking free. You don't know what my life was like before this. You don't know what I've had to endure, what choices I've had to make just to survive. Maybe this scheme with Harold isn't perfect, but it's the best chance I've had in years to build something better for myself. And what if Harold isn't what he seems? What if this whole thing is a trap? Then I'll deal with that when it happens. I've been dealing with men who want to use me or hurt me my whole life, Mr. Brennan. At least this time, I'm going into it with my eyes open. The fight went out of Cole as suddenly as it had appeared. He slumped back into his chair, suddenly looking older than his years. You're right, he said quietly. I don't know what your life has been like, and I've got no right to judge the choices you've made to survive it. But Sarah, he looked up at her, and she saw something vulnerable in his eyes that made her chest tight. I've seen too many good people destroyed by schemes like this. I've been part of destroying them. I can't stand by and watch it happen again, especially not to someone who... He trailed off, but Sarah heard the unfinished words as clearly as if he'd spoken them aloud. Especially not to someone who matters to me. "What are you saying?" she asked softly. Cole was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I'm saying that maybe there's another way. Maybe you don't have to choose between a dangerous scheme and a life of barely surviving. Maybe," he took a deep breath, "maybe you could stay here for a while. Help Miguel with the way station. Figure out what you really want instead of just what you think you can get. And what about you? I'll finish my contract with the cattle drive. After that," he shrugged. "After that, we'll see what happens." Sarah felt tears burning behind her eyes. Not tears of fear or pain this time, but something much more dangerous. Hope. But before she could answer, the sound of approaching horses shattered the moment. Miguel was at the window in an instant, his hand on the rifle that hung above the door. "Riders coming," he said grimly. "6 of them, riding hard. And unless I'm much mistaken, one of them is wearing a badge." Cole cursed under his breath as he joined Miguel at the window. Sheriff's posse. Someone must have reported the shooting. Or someone told them a very different story about what happened out there, Sarah said, her newfound hope crumbling into ash. As the riders drew closer, Cole realized that their troubles were just beginning, because the man wearing the sheriff's badge was someone he recognized, someone whose idea of justice had always been more about personal grudges than actual law. And Sheriff Wade Morrison had been nursing a grudge against Cole Brennan for a very long time. Sheriff Wade Morrison dismounted from his bay stallion with the careful movements of a man who'd been in the saddle too long and had too many old injuries to ignore. The badge on his vest caught the afternoon sunlight, but Sarah noticed it was tarnished and dented, like a piece of armor that had seen too many battles. His face was weathered leather stretched over sharp bones, and his pale blue eyes held the kind of coldness that came from years of seeing the worst humanity had to offer. "Miguel Santos," Morrison called out as he approached the way station, his 5 deputies spreading out behind him in a loose semicircle. "Heard you might be harboring some fugitives." Miguel stepped out onto the porch, his massive frame filling the doorway. "Sheriff Morrison, what brings you so far from your comfortable jail in Silver Creek?" "Got a report about a shooting this morning. 3 men dead, another wounded. Witnesses say a certain ex-outlaw named Cole Brennan was involved." Morrison's gaze swept over the building, looking for signs of his quarry. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" "I know that Cole Brennan is a good man who's trying to live an honest life," Miguel replied carefully. "Beyond that, I make it a policy not to involve myself in other people's business." Morrison laughed, but the sound held no warmth. "That's real convenient, Miguel." "Real convenient indeed." He gestured to his deputies. "Search the place. Every room, every building. I want Brennan found and brought to justice." Inside the way station, Cole stood with his back pressed against the wall beside the window, his hand resting on his gun. Sarah could see the tension in every line of his body, the way his jaw was clenched so tight she thought his teeth might crack. "There's a back door," Miguel had whispered before going outside. "Leads to the root cellar. You can get to the corral from there if you need to run." But Cole had shaken his head. "Running will just make me look guilty. Besides, I've got nothing to hide. 3 men tried to kill me and Miss Mitchell. I defended us. That's not murder. That's justice." Now listening to Morrison's cold voice outside, Sarah wasn't so sure that distinction would matter. There was something personal in the sheriff's tone, a hatred that went deeper than professional duty. "Mr. Brennan," she whispered, "who is that man? Why does he hate you?" Cole's expression darkened. "Wade Morrison. He's been sheriff of Silver Creek for the past 5 years. Before that, he was a deputy in Deadwood when I was riding with Black Pete's gang. You have history. We have history." Cole's voice was bitter with old pain. His younger brother Billy was a deputy too. Good kid, just 22 years old, engaged to be married. During one of our robberies, Billy tried to be a hero, went for his gun when he should have kept his hands where we could see them. Sarah's blood ran cold. "You killed him." "Pete killed him. But I was there. I could have stopped it maybe if I'd been quicker to act. Instead, I just stood there while Billy Morrison bled out in the street." Cole's hand tightened on his gun. "Wade's been hunting me ever since. Came close to catching me twice before I finally left the gang." The sound of boots on the wooden porch interrupted their whispered conversation. The front door opened, and one of Morrison's deputies stepped inside, his rifle held ready. He was young, maybe 25, with nervous eyes and sweat staining his shirt despite the cool air inside the building. "Anyone in here?" he called out. Cole stepped into view, his hands held away from his weapons but not quite raised in surrender. "Just me and the lady, deputy. No need for trouble." The deputy's eyes widened as he recognized Cole. "You're Brennan. Sheriff Morrison's been looking for you." "I figured as much. What's the charge?" "Murder. 3 counts." The deputy's voice shook slightly. "You're under arrest." "On whose word?" "Witness saw the whole thing. Says you ambushed those men without provocation, shot them down in cold blood." Sarah stepped forward, anger flaring in her chest. "That's a lie. Those men attacked us first. Mr. Brennan was defending me from outlaws who'd already robbed and beaten me." The deputy glanced at her, taking in her torn dress and bruised face for the first time. Confusion flickered in his eyes. "You were there." "I was their victim first, and Mr. Brennan saved my life. If you arrest him, you're letting the real criminals go free." Before the deputy could respond, Sheriff Morrison's voice cut through the air like a whip crack. "Johnson! What's taking so long in there?" "Found them, Sheriff," Johnson called back. "Brennan and a woman." Morrison appeared in the doorway, his pale eyes immediately locking onto Cole with an intensity that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Well, well, well. Cole Brennan. Been a long time." "Not long enough, Wade." Morrison stepped into the room, his hand resting on his gun butt. "You're under arrest for the murder of 3 men this morning. You have anything to say about that?" "I have plenty to say, starting with the fact that those 3 men were part of Black Pete Corrigan's gang, and they were trying to kill me and Miss Mitchell here. That's not how my witness tells it." "And who exactly is your witness?" Cole's voice was dangerously quiet. Morrison smiled, and Sarah felt her stomach drop at the cruelty in his expression. "Fellow name of Rusty Carlson. Says he was traveling the same road when he heard gunshots. Came to investigate and saw you murder 3 innocent travelers in cold blood." "Rusty Carlson," Cole repeated slowly. "Interesting that you take the word of a known horse thief and cattle rustler over that of an honest citizen." "Honest citizen?" Morrison laughed. "Is that what you're calling yourself these days?" "Last I checked, you were still wanted for robbery, assault, and accessory to murder in 3 different territories. Those charges were dropped 2 years ago when I testified against the Denver gang. Check your records, Wade. I'm a free man." Morrison's smile faltered slightly, but his hatred never wavered. "Maybe so. But that doesn't change what happened this morning. 3 men are dead, and you killed them." "3 outlaws are dead," Sarah interjected, her voice strong despite her fear. 3 men who robbed a stagecoach, beat me unconscious, and left me to die in the desert. Mr. Brennan saved my life, and if you arrest him, you're spitting in the face of every decent person in this territory." Morrison turned his cold gaze on her for the first time, and Sarah felt like she was being examined by a snake deciding whether she was worth the effort to strike. "And you are?" "Sarah Mitchell. I was a passenger on the stagecoach that Black Pete's gang robbed yesterday morning." "Can you prove that?" Sarah's heart sank as she realized she had no proof of anything. The outlaws had taken her luggage, her money, even her father's watch. She had nothing but her word and the bruises on her face. "The stagecoach wreckage is still out there," Cole said, "along with the bodies of the driver and guard that Pete's gang murdered. Convenient that the only witnesses are either dead or standing right here in this room," Morrison replied. "Makes it hard to verify your story, doesn't it?" Miguel chose that moment to enter the room, his presence filling the small space with quiet authority. "Sheriff Morrison, I hope you're not planning to arrest guests in my establishment without proper evidence." "I've got all the evidence I need, Miguel." Witness testimony in 3 dead bodies. "Witness testimony from Rusty Carlson?" Miguel's voice was carefully neutral, but Sarah caught the undercurrent of disdain. "The same Rusty Carlson who's been stealing cattle from the Martinez Ranch for the past 6 months?" Morrison's jaw tightened. "You got proof of that?" "I got eyes and a brain, which is more than some folks can say." Miguel's gaze never left Morrison's face. "But I also got something else that might interest you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. Found this blowing around my yard about an hour ago. Looks like it came from a stagecoach passenger's luggage. Sarah gasped as she recognized the paper. It was one of Harold's letters, the one where he'd outlined their plan to combine their resources. In all the chaos, she'd forgotten that her belongings had been scattered when the outlaws searched the coach. Morrison took the letter and read it quickly, his expression darkening with each line. Well now, this is interesting. Seems Miss Mitchell here isn't quite the innocent victim she's pretending to be. Cole stepped protectively in front of Sarah. What's that supposed to mean? Means your lady friend is planning to commit fraud. Marriage fraud, to be specific. Morrison looked up from the letter with satisfaction. That's a federal crime, Brennan, which means I can arrest both of you right now. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah felt the walls closing in around her as she realized her past had finally caught up with her in the worst possible way. She'd thought she was running toward a new life, but instead she dragged Cole into her web of lies and half-truths. Sheriff, Miguel said carefully, perhaps we could discuss this matter privately. There may be more to this situation than meets the eye. Morrison shook his head. The time for talking is over. Johnson, arrest them both. Brennan for murder, the woman for conspiracy to commit fraud. As the deputy moved forward with shackles, Cole's hand dropped to his gun. I won't be taken by a corrupt sheriff who's more interested in personal revenge than justice. Resist arrest and I'll add that to the charges, Morrison said with obvious satisfaction. Give me a reason to shoot you down, Brennan. I've been waiting 8 years for the chance. The tension in the room was explosive, ready to erupt into violence at the slightest provocation. Sarah could see Cole calculating his chances, measuring the distance between himself and Morrison's gun. She could also see that those chances weren't good, not with 5 armed deputies and a sheriff who wanted nothing more than an excuse to pull the trigger. Wait, she said, stepping forward. Sheriff Morrison, what if I could give you something more valuable than arresting us? Morrison's eyes narrowed. I'm listening. What if I could give you Black Pete Corrigan? The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Cole turned to stare at Sarah, his expression a mixture of admiration and horror at what she was proposing. You know where Pete is? Morrison asked. I know where he's going. And I know why. Sarah took a deep breath, committing herself to a path she wasn't sure she could walk. But I'll only tell you if you guarantee safe passage for Mr. Brennan and myself. Morrison considered this, his pale eyes calculating. Black Pete Corrigan was a bigger prize than one ex-outlaw, and a woman planning marriage fraud. Bringing in the leader of the territory's most notorious gang would make his career. You've got my attention, Miss Mitchell. Start talking. As Sarah began to weave a story that was part truth and part desperate fabrication, she caught Cole's eye and saw something there that made her heart race. Whether it was admiration for her quick thinking or concern for what she was getting them into, she couldn't tell. But she was about to find out just how far she was willing to go to protect the man who'd saved her life, and whether that protection might end up destroying them both. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she stared into Sheriff Morrison's cold blue eyes, knowing that the next words out of her mouth would either save them or seal their fate. Behind her, she could feel Cole's tension, like a coiled spring ready to snap, and she prayed he would trust her enough not to interfere with what she was about to do. Black Pete isn't just running from you, Sheriff, she began, her voice steadier than she had any right to expect. He's running towards something valuable enough that he'd risk coming back to territory where every lawman knows his face. Morrison leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued despite his suspicion. And what might that be? Sarah glanced at Miguel, drawing strength from the old man's calm presence. 3 weeks ago, a gold shipment went missing between Denver and Salt Lake City. Army payroll worth more than $50,000. The Army blamed it on Apaches, but that gold never made it to any tribal hands. You're saying Pete's gang took it? I'm saying Pete knows where it is, and I know where he's planning to collect it. The lie rolled off her tongue with surprising ease, born from desperation and a lifetime of learning to read people's weaknesses. Morrison wanted Black Pete more than he wanted revenge on Cole. At least, he wanted the reputation that would come from bringing in such a notorious outlaw. And Sarah was betting that greed would trump personal vendettas, at least temporarily. How could you possibly know that? Deputy Johnson asked, his young face creased with doubt. Sarah had been ready for that question. Because during the stagecoach attack, I heard Pete talking to his men about a rendezvous. He was angry that they'd wasted time robbing our coach when they should have been heading to something called Broken Mesa before the new moon. Morrison's eyes narrowed. Broken Mesa. That's 3 days' hard ride from here, up in the Badlands. Perfect place for an outlaw hideout. Or a perfect place to bury stolen gold until the heat dies down, Sarah added. Pete was wounded in our fight this morning. Wounded men make mistakes, take shortcuts they wouldn't normally risk. If you move fast, you could catch him and his remaining gang members at their own treasure site. Cole stepped up beside Sarah, his voice carefully controlled. And what exactly do you want in return for this information, Miss Mitchell? Sarah met his gaze, hoping he could see the apology in her eyes for what she was about to ask of him. Safe passage to Silver Creek for both of us. No arrests, no charges, no harassment from the law. That's quite a gamble, Morrison said slowly. If this information proves false, I'll hunt you both to the ends of the earth. And if it proves true? Morrison was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options. Sarah could practically see the calculations running through his mind. The political benefits of capturing Black Pete versus the personal satisfaction of destroying Cole. Finally, ambition won out over revenge. If Pete Corrigan is at Broken Mesa with stolen Army gold, I'll consider your debt to the law paid in full. His smile was sharp as a blade. But I want more than just information. I want you to help me take him. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. What do you mean? I mean, you're coming with us to Broken Mesa. You're going to walk into Pete's camp and distract him while my men get into position. Consider it part of your payment for avoiding a federal prison. Absolutely not, Cole said, his voice like thunder. I won't let you use her as bait for a madman like Pete. Morrison's hand moved to his gun. You don't have a choice in the matter, Brennan. Unless you'd prefer to settle our old differences right here and now. The standoff stretched taut between them, two dangerous men separated by 8 years of hatred in the width of a small room. Sarah could see Cole calculating again, measuring odds and angles, preparing for violence that would likely get them all killed. I'll do it, she said quickly, before the situation could explode. I'll help you catch Pete. Cole spun to face her, his gray eyes blazing with disbelief and fury. Sarah, no! You don't know what you're agreeing to. Pete will kill you the moment he realizes what's happening. Maybe, but he'll definitely kill both of us if we don't try. Sarah reached out and touched Cole's arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. This is our only chance, Cole. You know that as well as I do. Morrison watched their exchange with obvious satisfaction. Touching. Real touching. But the lady's right, Brennan. This is the only deal you're going to get from me. Miguel, who had been silent throughout the negotiation, finally spoke up. Sheriff Morrison, perhaps you should consider the wisdom of using a civilian in such a dangerous operation. If something goes wrong, I'll have one less problem to worry about, Morrison replied coldly. And if it goes right, I'll have the most notorious outlaw in the territory in custody. Either way, I win. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine at the casual way Morrison dismissed her life, but she forced herself to remain calm. When do we leave? First light tomorrow. That'll give us time to reach Broken Mesa by nightfall. Morrison turned to his deputies. Johnson, Riley, you're with me. Stevens, you and Martinez stay here and keep an eye on these two. If they try to run, shoot them. As the sheriff and 2 of his men prepared to leave, Cole grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her aside. His face was a mask of controlled fury, but she could see the fear underneath. Fear for her safety that made her chest tight with emotion she didn't dare examine too closely. This is insane, he whispered urgently. Pete isn't going to fall for some elaborate trap. He's too smart, too paranoid. And even if he does, Morrison isn't planning to keep his end of the bargain. He wants us both dead. I know, Sarah's voice was barely audible. But what choice do we have? If we run, we'll be fugitives for the rest of our lives. If we stay and fight, we'll be dead before sunset. At least this way, we have a chance to get you killed. a chance to end this. Pete, Morrison, all of it. Sarah looked into his eyes, wishing she could make him understand. Cole, I've been running from one bad situation after another my whole life. I'm tired of running, tired of being afraid. If this is how it ends, at least it ends with me fighting back. Cole's grip on her arm tightened. And what about Harold? What about your plan to claim your father's inheritance? Sarah almost laughed at the bitter irony of it. What inheritance? You saw Morrison's reaction to that letter? Even if we survive this, that plan is finished. Harold will probably be arrested the moment I set foot in Silver Creek. So what happens after we catch Pete? Assuming we survive, what then? The question hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. Sarah realized that somewhere in the chaos of the past 2 days, her entire world had shifted. The future she'd been so desperate to claim in Silver Creek now seemed like a pale shadow compared to the possibility of something real with the man standing before her. I don't know, she admitted. Maybe that depends on what you want to happen. Before Cole could answer, Morrison's voice cut through their whispered conversation. Enough talking. You two get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day, and I want everyone sharp when we ride into Pete's territory. That evening, as the sun set over the Badlands and painted the sky in shades of fire and blood, Sarah sat on the porch of the way station and tried to prepare herself for what might be her last night alive. Miguel had prepared a simple meal, but she found she had no appetite. Her stomach was too knotted with fear and anticipation to accept food. Cole emerged from the building and sat beside her on the wooden steps, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body but not quite touching. For a while they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. I've been thinking about what you said, Cole finally spoke, his voice low and thoughtful, about being tired of running. And I think I understand. I've been running too, in my own way. Running from my past, from the things I've done, from the man I used to be. But maybe running isn't the answer for either of us. Sarah turned to look at him, seeing something in his profile that made her heart race. What's the alternative? Fighting. Not with guns or violence, but with honesty, with choices that honor the people we want to be instead of the people we were. Cole met her gaze and she saw her own hopes reflected in his gray eyes. If we survive tomorrow, Sarah, I want to try something different. I want to try building a life instead of just surviving one. Together! The words slipped out before she could stop it, vulnerable and hopeful and terrifying all at once. Cole reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. If you'll have me. A broken-down ex-outlaw with more regrets than prospects isn't much of a catch, but you're a good man, Sarah finished for him, maybe the first truly good man I've ever known. They sat holding hands under the vast Montana sky, two wounded souls drawing comfort from each other's presence as they prepared to face whatever tomorrow might bring. Neither spoke of the very real possibility that this might be their last peaceful moment together, but both felt the weight of it settling over them like a benediction. In the distance, a coyote howled its loneliness to the moon, and Sarah shivered despite the warmth of Cole's hand in hers. Tomorrow they would ride into the heart of danger with a corrupt sheriff and a desperate plan that could easily get them both killed. But tonight, for just a few precious hours, they had each other. And sometimes, Sarah thought, as she leaned against Cole's strong shoulder, that was enough to make even the darkest future seem worth fighting for. Inside the way station, Deputy Stevens watched them through the window and shook his head. Young fools, he thought, planning for a future they'd probably never see. He'd been with Morrison long enough to know that the sheriff had no intention of honoring his bargain with the pair. Whatever happened at Broken Mesa, Cole Brennan and Sarah Mitchell wouldn't be coming back. The deputy turned away from the window and checked his rifle. Tomorrow was going to be a bloody day, and he wanted to be ready for whatever version of justice Sheriff Morrison had in mind. Dawn came too soon, and not soon enough, painting the Badlands in shades of copper and gold that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Sarah stood beside Cole's horse, checking the cinch on her borrowed saddle for the third time, her hands trembling despite her efforts to appear calm. The weight of the small derringer Miguel had pressed into her palm before they left felt both reassuring and terrifying against her hip. "Remember," Morrison said as he mounted his horse, his pale eyes fixed on Sarah with predatory intensity. "You walk into that camp alone. Tell Pete you escaped from me, that you need his protection. Keep him talking until you hear my signal." "And what exactly is your signal?" Cole asked, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Morrison smiled that cold smile that never reached his eyes. "You'll know it when you hear it." The ride to Broken Mesa took most of the day, following game trails and dry creek beds through country that seemed designed by God to hide desperate men from the law. Sarah found herself studying the landscape with new eyes, seeing it not as the harsh, unforgiving wilderness she'd feared since arriving in Montana, but as something wild and free that called to a part of her soul she'd never known existed. Cole rode beside her when the terrain allowed it, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of her thoughts. They didn't speak much during the journey, too many ears listening, too much at stake. But every time their eyes met, Sarah felt that spark of connection that had saved her sanity during the darkest moments of the past few days. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Broken Mesa rose before them like a fortress carved from red stone. The formation was aptly named, a flat-topped mountain that looked as if some giant had taken a massive axe to it, leaving behind sheer cliffs and hidden canyons that could shelter an army of outlaws. Morrison called a halt in a grove of cottonwoods about a mile from the base of the mesa. "This is where we part ways," he announced, dismounting and checking his weapons with the methodical care of a man preparing for war. "Miss Mitchell, you'll approach the camp from the south trail. My men and I will circle around and come from the north." Sarah's mouth went dry as the reality of what she was about to do hit her like a physical blow. She was going to walk alone into a camp full of desperate, violent men, trusting her life to the word of a corrupt sheriff who had every reason to want her dead. Cole must have seen something in her expression, because he moved his horse closer to hers and spoke in a voice too low for the others to hear. "You don't have to do this, Sarah. We can run. Right now, while they're not expecting it, and spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders?" Sarah shook her head. "No, Cole. This ends today, one way or another. If something goes wrong up there, then you make sure Morrison doesn't get away with it." Sarah reached out and touched his hand where it rested on his saddle horn. "Promise me that whatever happens, you won't let him claim he was just doing his duty." Cole's gray eyes burned with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I promise you that if Morrison betrays you, he won't live to see another sunset." Morrison's voice cut through their whispered conversation like a whip crack. "Enough! Miss Mitchell, you have your instructions. Follow that trail to the top of the mesa. You should reach Pete's camp just as the sun sets." Sarah dismounted and handed her horse's reins to Deputy Johnson, who at least had the grace to look uncomfortable with what they were asking her to do. She checked the Derringer one last time, making sure it was secure but accessible, then started toward the narrow trail that wound up the face of the cliff. The climb was treacherous, made worse by her exhaustion and the way her hands shook every time she thought about what waited at the top. Loose stones skittered away beneath her feet, and more than once she had to press herself against the rock face as the trail narrowed to barely 2 feet wide. But she kept climbing, driven by something stronger than fear. The knowledge that Cole was counting on her, and that failure meant not just her own death, but his as well. She smelled the smoke before she saw the camp. Wood smoke and something else. The scent of men who'd been living rough for too long. The trail leveled out onto a flat area, perhaps 50 yards across, sheltered on 3 sides by towering rock walls. Perfect for defense, with only one way in or out. Black Pete Corrigan sat beside a small fire, his wounded arm bound with strips of cloth that were stained dark with blood. 2 other men lounged nearby, their rifles within easy reach. Sarah recognized one of them as Rusty Carlson, the man who'd lied to Morrison about the morning's gunfight. "Well, well," Pete said as she stepped into the firelight, his voice hoarse with pain and fatigue. "If it ain't the little dove who caused me so much trouble, how'd you find your way up here, sweetheart?" Sarah forced herself to walk closer, every instinct screaming at her to run. "I followed you. Been tracking you all day." Pete laughed, but the sound held no humor. That sheriff's posse giving you trouble? Morrison arrested me and Cole Brennan. Said we murdered your boys in cold blood. Sarah put just the right amount of fear and desperation into her voice. I managed to slip away while they were making camp, but they'll be looking for me. I need help. Help? Pete's eyes glittered dangerously in the firelight. And what makes you think I'd help the woman who cost me 3 good men? Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to step even closer. Because you're a smart man, Mr. Corrigan. Smart enough to know that Morrison isn't after you because of some stagecoach robbery. He's after you because someone told him about the Army gold. The change in Pete's expression was immediate and deadly. His good hand moved to his gun, and the other 2 outlaws tensed like wolves scenting blood. What do you know about Army gold? I know it's worth $50,000. I know it's hidden somewhere up here in these Badlands, and I know that Morrison is planning to take it for himself once he catches you. Pete studied her with the intensity of a man whose life had depended on reading people's intentions. You're either very brave or very stupid, little dove. Maybe both. I'm desperate, Sarah said, which was probably the most honest thing she'd said all day. Morrison killed Cole Brennan in front of me, shot him down like a dog and laughed about it. I've got nowhere to go and no one to turn to. The lie about Cole's death tasted like poison in her mouth, but it had the desired effect. Pete relaxed slightly, convinced that she was just another desperate woman in need of protection. Well now, that changes things, he said, settling back against his saddle. Maybe we can help each other out after all. That's when Sarah heard it, the distinctive call of a nighthawk, repeated 3 times. Morrison's signal. She had perhaps 30 seconds before all hell broke loose. 30 seconds to either save Cole's life or ensure that they both died on this God-forsaken mesa. The Derringer felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds against her hip. Pete, she said, her voice barely steady, there's something else you should know. What's that, sweetheart? Morrison isn't coming tomorrow. He's here now. The words had barely left her mouth when gunfire erupted from the rocks above the camp. Pete and his men dove for cover as bullets sparked off stone and whined through the air like angry hornets. Sarah threw herself behind a boulder, her heart racing as she tried to figure out where Morrison's men were positioned. But something was wrong. The gunfire was coming from the wrong direction, and she could hear Cole's voice shouting orders somewhere in the darkness above them. Somehow Cole had gotten away from Morrison and circled around to the high ground. Pete was wounded and trapped, but he was still dangerous. As he scrambled for better cover, Sarah saw her chance. She pulled the Derringer from her belt and stepped out from behind the boulder. Pete! He turned toward her voice, and she saw his eyes widen as he realized what was happening. But it was too late. Sarah pulled the trigger, and Black Pete Corrigan pitched forward into the dirt. His reign of terror finally ended. The gunfight lasted perhaps 5 more minutes, but it felt like hours. When the smoke cleared, Rusty Carlson lay dead beside the fire, and the 3rd outlaw had surrendered with his hands in the air. Cole emerged from the rocks above, his rifle still smoking, his gray eyes searching frantically until they found Sarah. You all right? He called down to her. I'm alive, she called back, which seemed like the most she could hope for. It wasn't until later, as they made camp in a sheltered canyon miles away from Broken Mesa, that Sarah learned the full story. Cole had overpowered Deputy Stevens during the night and taken his weapons. When Morrison had tried to double-cross them at the mesa, Cole had been ready. Morrison? Sarah asked as Cole bandaged a graze on her arm where a bullet had come too close. Dead, along with Johnson and Riley. Stevens surrendered when he realized which way the wind was blowing. And us? Cole's hand stilled on the bandage. Free? The Army gold was real. Pete had it buried in a cave up there. Stevens is willing to testify that Morrison was planning to steal it for himself. That makes us heroes instead of criminals. Sarah looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. After everything they'd been through, it seemed almost impossible that they'd actually survived, that they were actually free. So what happens now? She asked. Cole finished tying off the bandage and sat back on his heels. Now we decide what we want our lives to look like, together. Sarah reached up and touched his face, feeling the roughness of his beard against her palm. I know what I want. What's that? A future. A real one. built on truth instead of lies, built with you. When Cole kissed her, it tasted like freedom and redemption and the promise of tomorrow. And for the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach in Montana, Sarah Mitchell knew exactly where she belonged. 6 months later, Sarah Brennan stood on the porch of their small ranch outside Silver Creek, watching her husband work with a young colt in the corral. The afternoon sun caught the silver in Cole's hair, and she smiled at the way he moved. With the same careful patience he'd shown her that first day when he'd wrapped his duster around her broken spirit and refused to let her die alone in the desert. The marriage had been real this time, performed by a genuine preacher in front of the whole town. Miguel had given her away, and even Deputy Stevens, now Sheriff Stevens, had attended the ceremony. The Army Gold reward had been enough to buy this land and stock it with cattle, but more importantly, it had bought them something precious, a chance to build a life based on truth instead of survival. Sarah's hand moved to her growing belly, where their first child rested safe and loved. Cole didn't know yet. She was planning to tell him tonight over dinner, when the sunset painted their valley in shades of gold and promise. The nightmares had stopped months ago, replaced by dreams of the future they were building together. Sometimes she thought about the woman she'd been when she first stepped off that stagecoach. Desperate, broken, willing to lie and cheat for a chance at something better. That woman seemed like a stranger now. Cole caught sight of her watching and tipped his hat with that easy smile that still made her heart skip. She waved back, thinking about how love had saved them both. Not the desperate kind that grew from fear and loneliness, but the steady, sure kind that grew from respect and shared courage. In the distance, thunder rumbled over the mountains, promising rain for their growing pastures. Sarah Brennan smiled and went inside to start dinner, ready for whatever storms might come. After all, she'd learned that sometimes the most beautiful things grew from the hardest ground, and sometimes when a broken woman met a good man on the loneliest trail in the world, miracles happened.